largest Siberian city of 600,000 people.
Siberia is valued in cubic meters, barrels, and tons. This enormous region has been viewed not as an independent entity with a life of its own, but rather as a location to be looted and exploited for profit ever since it was colonized by Tsarist Russia in the 17th century. Therefore, rather than being ashamed of, it is considered as an exceptionally proud achievement due to the floods, burning, felling, and selling off portions of it. It's merely uncharted land that needs to be shaped into lucrative contracts. Rather than being the ultimate goal, it serves as a guide. Massive, inhumane economic and environmental management continues to target it now. Keep watching as we reveal why Russia is on the brink of fragmentation and the shocking reason why Siberia wants to leave Russia. What are the Siberians running from? On the coast of eastern Russia in October 2022, two young Siberians got on a weak rowboat. Using a 15-foot boat meant for use on inland streams and lakes, their mission was straightforward: to cross the 300 miles of the Bering Sea, one of the world's coldest and most treacherous oceans. With any luck, they would make it to Alaska in one piece and then seek refuge from the ghost that has been plaguing the Siberian tundra for the better part of 5 centuries. You can't put a price on the desperation these Siberians showed. However, it remains unclear from what precisely they were fleeing. Local fishermen have characterized the stretch of ocean they traversed as being in a constant state of storm. Extremely cold weather, huge floating ice chunks, and enormous waves make this sea one to avoid unprepared for a hypothermic crisis. Even huge, well-equipped commercial fishing vessels find this area treacherous. The two Russians attempting to evade detection have the backing of the Coast Guard. They were prepared to take risks, though, because these men were not afraid of danger. For them, the prospect of being drafted and compelled to fight on the front lines in Ukraine was far more terrifying than the prospect of drowning at sea. Because of discriminatory Russian legislation, these individuals were among the most likely to perish at sea because of their ethnic Siberian background. As a result of Russia's biased practices, these guys were among the most likely to be recruited and sent to fight in the conflict in Ukraine. These guys were not afraid to take risks, you know. They were among the most vulnerable guys to drowning at sea because of Russia's discrimination legislation. Those guys were prepared to give it their all as far as the story goes. Russia's ethnic minority bore the brunt of the tragedy. They were merely ammunition for the cannons. It seems that this is still the norm in Putin's Russia, even though we are well into the 21st century. Russia was able to hide the real cost of the war in Ukraine from the majority of its urban population by recruiting men from Siberian villages that were culturally and infrastructure-wise isolated from mainstream Russian society. This strategy came at the expense of Russia's ethnic minorities. While being utilized to weaken Putin's external opponents, the Siberian regions were depleted of their young men of fighting age, despite the fact that many of them had been vociferous internal opponents against Moscow's abuses of power. Russian elites and generals would come to realize how insignificant these individuals were throughout the upcoming months of war. The conflict in Ukraine is only the beginning of this intense story. The Russian Federation is enormous. It is a massive entity that extends over numerous continents. Russia used to be so big that it had substantial holdings in North America, Europe, and Asia, all at once. Presently, Russia's landmass accounts for an astounding 1/8 of the world's total and encompasses 11 time zones. Russia boasts the biggest population and the biggest landmass on Earth. Of all the nations in the universe, Russia is the biggest, dominating all others. Russia is about twice the size of the contiguous United States due to its extensive geographical holdings, while Canada, the second largest nation in the world, is slightly more than half of Russia. Huge swathes of distinct human populations, cut off from one another and the rest of the globe, are to be expected in any region of the Earth that occupies such a massive amount of land due to factors such as great distances and insurmountable geological obstacles. At first divided by geography and thereafter by civilization. Russia is also not an exception. Within its borders, you can hear more than 100 distinct languages spoken by people from 85 different areas. Of them, 22 are republics, meaning they have their own legislature, official language, and seem to be independent in everything except foreign affairs. The seeming independence, for reasons we'll discuss in more detail later. This nation is incredibly varied. Furthermore, many Russians have stronger genetic links to Mongolians than to Russians residing in the major cities west of the Ural Mountains, which often surprises outsiders who think they are more European. Russia is home to a wide variety of ethnic and religious minorities, many of which call some of the world's most inaccessible rural communities home. It wasn't always like this, though. Russian Siberia was dominated by independent tribes. Independent tribes ruled Russian Siberia hundreds of years ago, and Russia's control was limited to the Eastern European territories west of the Ural Mountains. The Ural Mountains still separate Russia's major cities and political centers from more remote Siberian regions today. At that time, Russia was less of an empire and more of a loose confederation of culturally similar city-states. These would eventually become the modern metropolises of Moscow, Kyiv, Novgorod, and Rostov. And they were primarily concerned with regional international affairs, knowing little about or interested in the strange and hostile territories to the east. Both the Russian people and the faraway Siberian tribesmen across the Urals considered the other side to be non-existent for the great bulk of human history. When Genghis Khan's Golden Horde arrived from the south of these odd eastern territories in the mid-13th century, though, everything started to change. After years of war for the Russian Empire, the Golden Horde was overcome by the Mongol Empire and enslaved and subjugated. This film will delve into the fact that this maneuver set in motion a series of attacks and retribution that continues to this day, defining Russian history and even contemporary problems. The Golden Horde brutally oppressed the Russian people for hundreds of years. During their zenith, the Mongol Empire ruled nearly a quarter of the planet. They used shocking acts of brutality meant to instill terror in their subjects as a means of controlling these expansive lands. Historians generally agree that Genghis Khan's conquests were responsible for the deaths of around 40 million people, roughly 10% of the world's population at the time, due to the extreme brutality they imposed. At the outset of their own empire, the Russians witnessed this savagery firsthand and took careful notes. It was a type of old psychological warfare that made sure people were too terrified to oppose his reign. They would remember these tales and these examples when the time came to begin their own rule. Moscow, a city-state in Russia, started to gain prominence after a few generations and managed to unite the other city-states in Russia into an army that drove the Golden Horde out and restored Russian freedom. At least this time, we'll be a more united nation. Their shared animosity and terror of the Mongols brought them together more than anything else. Their animosity and dread of the Siberian tribes will soon be combined with the knowledge they had gained from the Golden Horde regarding the conquest and administration of a large empire east of the Ural Mountains. To prevent further invasions by the Mongols and other eastern tribes, the newly formed Moscow League immediately set out to fortify its boundaries. Sitting on a huge meadow with essentially no strategically defensible terrain, Russia had been an easy target for the Mongol invasion. In order to address this, the Russians would have to advance eastward in search of a natural border. They would have to traverse the Ural Mountains, which occupied the majority of their eastern flank, and then continue their advance in search of a river that could fortify their southern frontier. The icy, uncharted tundra of Siberia would be their final destination. The Russians' objectives shifted as they discovered a river boundary and a huge expanse of undeveloped territory rich with unrealized riches as they advanced eastward. As a result of the region's frigid climate, the local animals were able to produce exceptionally thick fur coats of superior quality, which, if collected in sufficient quantities, would have brought immense wealth to the Russian people, or at least the Russian czars, through trade. The issue was that Siberia was geographically distant from Russia's urban centers, and even in those ancient times, few would have wanted to abandon the warmth and safety of a well-established city-state like Moscow to traipse through the icy tundra in search of furs. Russia was fortunate, nevertheless, because Siberia possessed still another unrealized resource. There were other humans in the area, and they were quite good hunters. While some of these people lived freely, others were indebted to the Mongol Empire, Russia's longtime enemy, and paid tribute to them. The Russian czars got a sinister notion from this. Here, history would record what may be characterized as an early example of the now famous Russian whataboutism, in which Russia pretends to be morally outraged by the actions of others, before doing precisely what it is that it claims to be outraged about the first chance it gets, citing the actions of others as an excuse. Here, the rising Russian Empire, which had originally extended eastward to stave off the Mongols, would wind up being the one demanding tribute instead of the Mongols, proving that they were fine with oppression, so long as they weren't the oppressed. Russia offers the native Siberian tribes a deal. Russia would make a once-in-a-lifetime offer to the indigenous Siberian people. As long as they joined their empire and sent furs to Russian outposts across Siberia on a regular basis, they would let them survive. When the Russian army threatened to use force to exact tribute from the Siberian people, the result was often resentment and rebellion. So the plan evolved into something a little more complex over time in an effort to make the Russian army look better. Russia would deploy government-backed Cossack raiders to terrorize the settlements instead of outright threatening them with violence. Then they would pledge to defend the Siberians from the raiders in return for fur tributes. Russia was able to collect fur contributions while maintaining its image of benevolence instead of conquest. During the negotiations, it was conveniently omitted that they and the raiders were actually the same entity. For example, after annexing Crimea in 2014, Russia sent government-backed rebels to create a conflict in eastern Ukraine, demonstrating that this sort of false flag strike is still very much a part of Russian geopolitics today. Russia instigated domestic unrest by delivering parcels posing as humanitarian aid but actually containing weaponry. Vladimir Putin, ostensibly to defend the ethnic Russians in the area, launched the Russian army in response to over a decade of conflict in the region, fostered by the Kremlin. However, similar to the raids on the Siberian villages, there is substantial evidence that Russia, and not Ukraine, was accountable for the persecution they professed to be rescuing the local population from. Going back to Siberia, this was obviously a thoroughly horrible plan, but it worked. Russia could simply dispatch a sufficient number of well-armed soldiers to the area, intimidate the natives into submission, and then secure the trade routes by garrisoning forts and fending off fictitious foes. This would save money compared to sending Russian workers to the region. The native inhabitants would unwittingly play a key role in the Russian fur trade, putting in countless hours of labor and providing every vital skill, while the wealthy Russians living west of the Urals, who had seldom set foot in Siberia, would reap the benefits. The Tsars were some of the wealthiest people in history thanks to their fur offerings. Their wealth had grown to an estimated $300 billion by the time Tsar Nicholas II was in power, which is roughly twice as much as Jeff Bezos, creator of Amazon, is worth today. This accumulation occurred during World War I. However, the Siberians did not passively accept this new reality. Not having enough fighting men or much of a culture of battle meant that some of the smaller tribes just gave up without a struggle. Yet other indigenous groups brutally fought back. The Russian Empire was eager to demonstrate the extent to which their Mongol ancestry had shaped them when this occurred. One example is the Mongol-like depopulation effort that decreased the Dalberg tribe's numbers from 20,000 to less than 8,000 in barely half a century after they initially opposed Russian control on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Russia saw the futility of trying to conquer all of Siberia on their own when they encountered stronger resistance. As a result, they started using methods that would make their adversaries fight on their behalf, which was an upgraded version of the Cossack Raider false flag approach. They set up fake conflicts pitting various ethnic groups against one another through propaganda, and then they played both sides in a divide-and-conquer scheme behind the scenes. This is also a tactic that some contemporary Russians, particularly those interested in the political ideology of the Tsars, continue to adopt. Take the two most recent US elections as an example. It has come to light that groups of Russian hackers and social media trolls were deliberately trying to sow political discord in the US, leading to real-life conflicts that were instigated by Russian agents. Returning to the original point, the Siberian people's resistance was fruitless because they were divided into small, disorganized tribes that lacked the resources to mount a united front. The systematic and relatively painless conquering of various Siberian peoples had an unanticipated impact on Russian national identity. The Siberian tribe falls to the Russian whim. The Russians became overconfident as they crushed Siberian tribe after Siberian tribe at the hands of the Russians. They started to believe they had divinely bestowed superhuman strength upon them, making them unstoppable and doomed to greatness. Because Russia was so easy to conquer, the idea of endless expansion became a motif of the Russian czars. From the czars of Peter the Great to the Romanovs, the last Russian dynasty, the expectation was that each generation would acquire new lands. The rub is that by the time the Romanovs came up, Russia had exhausted its supply of minor tribes to subjugate, and when it turned its attention to conquest of a true empire, it was humiliatingly defeated in combat by Japan. Vladimir Putin even made a passing reference to the notion of divine greatness and favor that originated from Russia's conquest of Siberia during his invasion of Ukraine, which he partially justified by portraying it as a holy war against the corrupt and wicked West. This idea has been passed down through the generations in Russia. However, this belief in Russia's invincibility would have catastrophic consequences. The harsh Siberian geography would be conquered by Russia in the end because of its ease and sparse population, but they would be unable to advance into more desirable territory in warmer climates where more strong dynasties already lived. Even though Siberia was officially a part of Russia's empire, it was really just a geographical outpost. The enormous size and relatively low population density of Siberia made it uneconomical to administer. Russia, in contrast to other global empires, did not build a robust administrative presence or spread Russian culture among its new subjects. Instead, it satisfied itself with strategically placed trading posts and fortresses to safeguard key roads and river crossings and plunder the Siberian people for their wealth. There was a marked cultural difference between the ethnic Siberians and Moscow, and they persisted in using their native languages and customs. This, however, was not due to Russia's concern for maintaining its cultural character. It was due to the fact that Russia was uninterested in governing them. Siberians becomes part of the Russian Empire. When the Siberians went to the next trade station to bring fur tribute or fought off a government-organized raid on their hamlet because they had failed to do so, that was often their only contact with the Russian Empire. This meant that a lot of Siberians had no idea they were actually a member of the Russian Empire. There is a disturbing pattern that persists to this day regarding the infrastructure of the Russian Empire. The few roads that were constructed were deliberately meant to connect back to Moscow, not to connect the different Siberian civilizations with each other. Efficient use of resources was a factor, but politics had a larger role. Russia had hoped that the Siberian people would band together and win their independence from the Mongols in the same manner that the Russian city-states had done, but by keeping them connected to Moscow and apart, they were reducing their prospects of success. Russia maintained territorial separation in order to exploit Siberian riches rather than to disseminate Russian culture, because the locals would simply bring resources to the local trading post when the Russians were afraid for their lives. There was no need to map out the new territory. As a result, internal maps of Siberia were extremely sparse, and much of the area remained a mystery. However, there was a complete lack of infrastructure in the realm of foreign politics, and political maps were a whole other ballgame compared to internal ones. Although Russia did not have much of a real empire to show for it, its sheer size enabled it to become recognized as an imperial force. Other European powers began to take Russia seriously just because they were on the map. Similar to how Russia routinely displays its nuclear missiles in military parades to intimidate their geopolitical rivals, the country secretly worries that its nuclear weapons may be rendered useless as a result of corruption and postponed maintenance over the years. The heritage of the Russian Empire persists, both in the exterior representation and the interior reality. The Soviet Union. Throughout most of Russia's history, this was the primary means by which Siberia was isolated from the rest of the country. However, when the Soviet Union took over, things started to change, and not for the better. On paper, the Soviet Union recognized the independence of the several Siberian ethnic groups who had paid homage to the empire for many years, while preserving their own culture and identity. However, under Soviet control, the Siberian situation would deteriorate in numerous respects compared to that of the Tsars. Furs were no longer prized as highly as they previously were in the old world of international trade, and the Soviet Union considered the Siberian people to be Siberia's most precious asset. 20% of Siberian natives were drafted by the Soviet Union to fight on the front lines of World War II, despite the fact that the conflict had no connection to their homelands or customs. Like everything else in Siberia, the Siberians were perceived as nothing more than resources to be used for the power and profit of the elite in Moscow. They had evolved from being exploited for their wealth to being pieces in a bigger geopolitical game. When things got back to earth, the communists pushed centralized farming practices on the nomadic Siberian people. This led to the eradication of Siberian traditions and the forced removal of children from their homes and their instruction in Soviet culture. The Siberians were pressured to embrace Russian as their primary language, marking the first instance of attempts to stifle native tongues. It was a complete and utter bust. As an extreme example, consider the Soviet Union's foray into reindeer herding. The herders' cultures were predominantly altruistic and based on principles of communal sharing that transcended the Soviet bureaucracy. As a result, communism failed among them. Siberian indigenous communities have relied on their extensive body of knowledge to guide their reindeer herding tactics for millennia. There was no distinction between work and play in their way of life, and everyone was involved. You simply were and did what you did best. You herded reindeer. Simply put, life went on. Soviet bureaucrats were unable to gauge the tribe's output because of this, so they instituted strict and arbitrary work and rest schedules. Inadequate care for the reindeer herds led to their failure, and the tribesmen were chastised for their sloth and lack of effort. However, the truth was that their origin was merely culturally distinct. Some Siberians did manage to improve their lot in life while living under the Soviet Union. The Russian Empire's demise in 1917 led to the dissolution of the fur tax on Siberians and the subsequent rise of autonomous, independent Siberian republics across Russia. It appeared like a positive step forward when these republics established their own constitutions, national anthems, and official languages. For a brief moment, conditions improved even further as the Soviet Union collapsed. substantial rights and autonomy were granted to the republics around the creation of the Russian Federation in 1992. It appeared as though Siberia had at last slipped the powerful hands of the Tsars of Russia, Putin. Vladimir Prokofiev, however, arrived later. Vladimir Prokofiev Putin. Putin, in keeping with Tsarist ideology, considered Siberia as too lucrative to pass up. Centralization, the abolition of republican autonomy in Russia, and their eventual alignment was one of his primary goals upon taking office. Possible motivation: the Chechen War, which Putin supervised upon becoming office and which demonstrated the peril of giving republics too much independence, may have prompted this move. Whatever his motivation, Putin was hell-bent on stripping the republics of their rights. While still in his second year as president, he oversaw the formation of the Kozak Commission in 2001. The Commission's declared aim was to strike a balance between the authority of the Russian federal government and that of the several republics. But in reality, it accomplished nothing more than to transfer power from the regions to Putin's administration by eliminating their autonomy. Since then, the Russian Republic has lost so much independence that not even the European Parliament recognizes Russia as a federation, but as a unitary state. There may be serious ramifications for Siberian identity as a result of this one state. The Russian Empire could never have dreamed of the mass communication and education possibilities made possible by the advent of modern technology, such as the internet, television, and radio. In this modern Russia, Putin's goal is not ethnic group segregation, but rather their assimilation into a single Russian identity. Russian state-sponsored television is one of the few sources of information accessible in some of the most remote districts of Siberia, where internet access is not affordable for the majority of the population. Due to the lack of alternative sources, many Siberians are particularly susceptible to propaganda from the Kremlin. Because of this, their own past is being continually whitewashed. Russia is being portrayed as their national savior, and they are being recruited into Russia's wars, particularly by those without alternative means of subsistence. Because, as one might assume, the poverty rate among Siberians is far higher than that of other Russians living west of the Urals. A disproportionate number of Siberians are serving as frontline soldiers in Ukraine, mostly as a result of recruitment efforts that disproportionately affect ethnic minorities and Kremlin propaganda. Although it stays faithful to the era of the Tsars, the conflict disproportionately affects the poorer Russians living in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Russian Empire will endure forever. Fortunately, not every Siberian has fallen for Putin's charms. Some have kept their heritage alive and can see through the Kremlin's propaganda, remembering that their forefathers were the objects of the same kind of rhetoric not long ago, when Russia sought to invade their territories rather than Ukraine. When speaking with a Russian military recruiter, one Siberian had the perfect response. They said, "We don't even have a present," in response to the statement that they should struggle for their future. By future, do you mean? Like the two Siberians who boarded a rowboat to cross the Bering Sea at the beginning of this film, he prudently avoided being involved in the battle. They might have faced something similar to what a soldier from a Siberian town near Lake Baikal recounted if they had been deployed to the front lines. Supposedly, we would get training in Rostov, so they loaded us onto a bus to go there. Since they anticipated that half of us would not survive the flight, they even allowed us to smoke on board. In front of us, the officers discussed it openly, and they were correct. Without the promised training, we were whisked away to Ukraine the moment we landed in Rostov. Upon our initial arrival, we were shelled and 8 soldiers were murdered instantly. Even though the last Tsar has passed away, the Russian Empire's heritage will endure. Outro. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like this video and subscribe for more enlightening videos like this. We'll see you on the next one.